and just talk to you about my experiences in China, but how perhaps they can begin to illuminate and feed into a broader discussion about what journalism can and should be doing in this area of the world where there are pressures on journalism in so many countries, from authoritarian politics and power play, and what experiences in China may tell us about what journalism needs to do to respond to those pressures, and what journalism in democratic societies like Taiwan in particular could be doing as well. So the first thing I need to explain about myself is I am one of those exiled reporters who Thompson just mentioned then, who was in China before. And I had to leave in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. I arrived in Taiwan at the end of last year, so I am a Taiwan baby. So I do have perhaps some comments about Taiwan, but I feel very ill-qualified to offer many opinions when I've only spent less than a year in Taiwan. So if I have more to say about China, it's no disrespect. It's simply that I feel that others are much more qualified to talk about the reporting environment in Taiwan. And so what I'm going to do is just to rush through very quickly my experiences in China, but also to offer you some points that I hope will become a provocation for a discussion and a Q&A about the theme of today's session. So just to begin with, I want to lay out just some broad points at the top of a story. When we do journalism now, we always, Phil will remind me this as well, always tell the readers what you're going to be talking about first, and then repeat it several times, yes? So that's what I'm going to do. I'll just raise several points first, and then I'll go through and explain why they're on my mind in this session today. First of all, when we have these discussions about reporting in different societies in different countries, often people start talking about what the rules and the regulations for governing journalism are. The Chinese government has its rules and regulations. India does as well. Each country has its own regime of laws that govern what journalism can do, especially laws about laws about slander and so on that can also affect journalism. But one of the points I often make when talking about my experience in China is that laws and rules are one thing, but what really makes for productive journalism, what makes for a society, a country with productive and good journalism, is the society in which journalism operates. The rules and laws are important, but I think what is supremely important in the end is this kind of society we operate in. And that comes back to something that Thompson was talking about, the importance of society, civil society, independent voices in inspiring journalism, in pressing us to do our job better. And if you don't have that, you can have the best rules in the world, but journalism is still going to wither and shrink away unless you have a vigorous and lively civil society, including universities, that can be a part of that conversation which is held through journalism. And that was always very much my experience in China. I worked in China from the 1990s under Phil. And that was a time of great change in China. Some of you may remember it. Some of you may have experienced it by visiting or even reporting there. A time when there was an emerging civil society of human rights actors, of dissidents, of independent local journalism, all of which was feeding into a sense that China was changing in a generally more liberal way. So I should say I've put up some slides up here today, so nothing in particular, but some slides with memories of reporting on China. So perhaps if we could start going through those, could you just press through it? Thank you. And so for some time in China, there was certainly not a democratic society, but a more liberalizing society where there was a pool of civil society activity which we as journalists could tap into. And of course, that began to change drastically, especially in the past 10 years under Xi Jinping. And what we've seen in China since then is not just for journalists like me who've been forced out of China, but within China as well. It's become so much more difficult to get those stories, so much more difficult to speak to academics, can't even talk to many human rights activists now because they've all been arrested or silenced. And so what we've seen in China is the actual rules governing foreign journalists haven't changed that much. But the environment that we work in has changed drastically to the point where the kind of journalism that was possible 10 years ago, certainly, but even 5 years ago, is unthinkable these days. So that comes on to my second point, which is I work for the New York Times, one of America's better-known papers, one of the world's better-known papers, which has a high sense of self-regard, I would say, thinks highly of itself. But as a journalist who had to work in China, is now working in Taiwan, for us, foreign journalists working in Taiwan or China somewhere, our vital lifeblood is local journalism as well. If we're going to tell our stories to an international audience, often the information that feeds into our stories, the ideas that feed into our stories, the people that we interview, often we first find about them through local journalism. And in a society that doesn't support vigorous, diverse, healthy local journalism, our job becomes much harder as well. I think you see that particularly in China these days. It is, as Thompson said, it's become so much more difficult to report, not just for people like me who now have to work from abroad, but also within Beijing as well. And part of the reason for that is the death of Chinese journalism. It survives in the crevices, on the edges of some news outlets in China, but it's become so much more difficult for local journalists to work there. So when I come to Taiwan and I see the explosion of voices here, how easy it is to interview people, the diversity of voices. There's all sorts of debate we can have about the state of Taiwanese journalism, but that diversity and freedom and that willingness of people to speak out, I think, is really essential, an important part of our lifeblood as international journalists as well.